The 2000s were an interesting period for music and almost a transition from the loud rock music that dominated the 90s to the more hip-hop and softer indie music of the mid to late 2010s. This being said, in the 2000s there was still a lot of creative energy in the loud rock world. After the pop-punk explosion in the late 90s with bands like Green Day, Blink-182, and The Offspring, pop-punk had really taken off and developed a branch that presented a much more accessible sound than its Ramones and Descendants-inspired beginnings in the early 90s. Genres like post-hardcore and metalcore also began popping up around this time, and while these types of bands weren't quite as punk-sounding as the TRL pop-punk stuff, they did have a sense of aggression that bands like Sum 41, Newfound Glory, and Fall Out Boy didn't. In terms of punk rock in particular, though, it was in some ways slowing down. However, the bulk of the fan base was still relatively young at this point, and there were a number of younger fans that entered the genre at this time. As a punk fan who was born in the 90s, I'm certainly an example of this, and I'm probably not the only person from this age range that can point to one band that got them into punk in the first place.
How's it going, folks? My name is Jack Miller. I am the incredibly underqualified punk historian, and in this video I want to talk about one of the first punk rock bands I ever got into and give my thoughts on why I think they had such a significant impact on music, and discuss why I think they deserve a little more credit from the scene they came out of. That band is none other than Rise Against.
While they're by no means the only punk band to take shape and rise up during the 2000s, they're without question the most notable. Quite honestly, in 2006, Rise Against recreated a similar punk rock success story that hadn't been seen since the mid-90s when NoFX and Bad Religion blew up. The band made their debut on Fat Records in the early 2000s with former 88 Fingers Louie members Joe Principe and Dan Precision in the original lineup, and they started out with a skate punk sound very similar to 88's. While this era of the band is awesome, and I'd personally consider The Unraveling to be my favorite album of theirs, objectively speaking, replicating 88 Fingers Louie's sound with some minor tweaks here and there and a different singer wasn't going to propel them into the spotlight the way some of their later material would. This being said, though, there's definitely some tracks on this record like 1000 Good Intentions, Ever Changing, and My Life Inside Your Heart that sort of preview the sound Rise Against would grow into in later years.
Not to mention, Tim McElrath's take on the more clean, melodic vocal style definitely did add something to the formula that set them aside from other skate punk bands at the time, without making them sound like another No Use for a Name or Lagwagon clone.
Their sophomore album, Revolutions Per Minute, and final full-length release on Fat Wreck would push them even further towards the explosion that would inevitably happen in 2006. While the skate punk influence is still really present on this record, it isn't hard to see that they were onto something new and definitely growing into their own flavor of punk rock. Even though I love this album too, I feel like it wasn't until their 2004 release, Siren Song of the Counterculture, that we saw the band fully develop into the sound that would put them into the position to take over as they did. Going into the mid-2000s, there was also a shift in trends within punk music as a whole, at least as far as melodic punk goes. As much as this pains me to say, the 90s skate punk sound was becoming a little bit tired at this point, as the genre had pretty much fully developed on everything it had to offer. This was around the time that all the tech punk bands like A Wilhelm Scream, Strike Anywhere, and Poor Habit came out, taking on a much more technical approach to skate punk, kind of like what Propaganda had started doing a few years prior. Also around this time, bands like None More Black, Smoke and Fire, and the Lawrence Arms would emerge with a new breed of more punk-oriented pop punk, or as I like to call, fest pop punk, that took a lot of influence from bands like D4, Lifetime, and Avail, as opposed to the more Screeching Weasel, Descendants-inspired bands of the 90s and early 2000s. If you want to hear more about this stuff, I talked about it a bunch in my pop punk video, and I'll be sure to link that in the description.
This is worth noting here because I think the Rise Against sound in the mid-2000s was almost a perfect balance of the two different breeds of melodic punk that were taking over the scene at the time.
While their music certainly has never been as technical or guitar-oriented as a band like Wilhelm or Propaganda, Rise Against do have pretty deep roots in skate punk, much like all the tech punk bands. Also, at the same time, they weren't afraid to write a few songs that maybe weren't as up-tempo and put some more emphasis on melodic songwriting in a similar fashion to what Smoke or Fire and None More Black were doing, rather than just let melody and songwriting take a backseat to fast drums and complicated riffing on every song like a lot of the tech punk bands tended to do.
While older bands like NoFX, Pennywise, and Bad Religion were still around at this time, they weren't really adding anything new to the table, as they were still the same NoFX, Pennywise, and Bad Religion that we had in the 90s.
Rise Against weren't only doing something new, but they were a happy medium of everything new in melodic punk, and I think this is a big reason why they were able to reach a bigger audience than, say, Off With Their Heads or Strike Anywhere.
Anyways, 2006 was the year Sufferer and The Witness came out. Rise Against also played as a headlining band at Warped Tour that year. They had played Warped in the past, but this was their first time as a headliner.
Now, keep in mind, Warped Tour wasn't strictly a punk show anymore at this point. And while there were a lot of bands like NoFX, The Casualties, and The Bouncing Souls that were still playing Warped in the 2000s, at this point punk was definitely sharing the stage with other genres like TRL pop punk, post-hardcore, and metalcore that tended to attract a younger audience. In other words, it was pretty rare that a new punk band would headline on Warped Tour in the mid-2000s. In response to this change, there was certainly a mixed bag of reactions from different punk bands, and there's some almost famous cases of band disagreements at Warped Tour that happened around this time. Of course, when NoFX would make fun of newer bands, it was done in a much more lighthearted way, and seen as almost a rite of passage for the younger bands. Given that NoFX is a band that's known for making fun of literally everything and everyone, the guys from Under Oath probably took their jokes with a grain of salt as they intended. On the other hand, though, there were definitely cases like the Guttermouth incident in 2004, where Guttermouth were kind of just being dicks to Simple Plan and a few other bands and were eventually asked to leave the tour. While post-hardcore, metalcore, and nu metal aren't genres I've ever been strongly attached to myself, bands like Slipknot, Chiodos, and Asking Alexandria are definitely very successful bands with really dedicated followings, and the fact that Rise Against weren't making fun of those kinds of bands probably earned them some fans. Especially since after they took off in the mid to late 2000s, they started playing some of those big rock festivals that had lineups with a lot of bands from these genres.
Since Rise Against were so universally loved at this point, it wasn't uncommon for their music videos to get aired on music TV channels, or for a couple of their songs maybe to be played on an alternative radio station.
As a result of their success, though, they started getting backlash from some of the snobbier punk fans, especially after they released Appeal to Reason in 2008. You'd hear the usual punk elitist crap like sellouts and corporate getting thrown at them because at this point there was no question they were making money off of being a band, but they were also playing shows with some bands that weren't necessarily the favorites of the punk community and were signed to a major label. If you ask me, though, I don't see all that much of a difference in the position Rise Against was in the late 2000s to where Bad Religion was in the mid-90s. In both cases, the band was on a major label, but they were still writing the music they wanted to make and touring with other punk bands on a pretty regular basis. You would definitely see both bands playing at big rock festivals or maybe touring with a more mainstream-friendly band from time to time, but let's be real here. If not for them, who is going to expose new people to punk rock?
It's not like Pearl Jam would have taken a band like Jughead's Revenge or Disrupt on tour with them in 1995 like they did with Bad Religion, because bands like that are just too niche to win over a mainstream rock crowd.
Knowing this, how is that any different from the time Rise Against supported My Chemical Romance in 2007? It wouldn't have worked the same way if a band like the Wilhelm Scream or Leftover Crack had been on that tour, because just like before, bands like that are just too out there to win over a crowd that for the most part isn't a punk audience. Though I can't deny I think they've slowed down a little bit in recent years, with their last two releases not capturing the same sense of energy as those before them. It's impossible for a band to stay in their prime forever. Also, I feel like I have to bring this up here because it seems to be a pretty common gripe people have with Rise Against, even though it isn't really something that bothers me all that much. But they've sort of become the punk rock poster boys for PETA, and while they're by no means the only punk band that promotes veganism, they're a lot more well-known than, say, Good Riddance or Earth Crisis. And there's a certain amount of baggage that comes with being a vegan no matter who you are, especially if you're particularly vocal about it.
If you're famous to any extent, and one of the things you're famous for is being a vegan, the unfortunate reality is that there's just going to be people that hate you for that reason alone.
As one of the only big-name punk bands to come out of the 2000s, they're kind of in a different position than a band like NoFX or Rancid, where a portion of their audience just isn't really a punk audience. They've definitely been on a number of tours in the past few years that I can't say I would have wanted to see myself, but I don't think that makes them any less important to the genre overall. For as many different types of fans Rise Against have, their shows tend to be a really good time, and they seem to be a band with a very come-as-you-are type of fan base that keeps gatekeeping to a minimum. You might be into skate punk and hardcore, maybe pop punk and third wave ska, post-hardcore and metalcore, whatever. Everyone in the building that night is there because they're all Rise Against fans, and that's the type of environment I wish was more common in music culture as a whole.
But that's just why I think Rise Against is an important band. I want to hear what you have to say. Do you have a favorite Rise Against album? If so, which one? Thanks for watching. See you next time.